The first Guardians of the Galaxy movie was pretty good. I'd say definitely within the top 10 of the entire MCU. The sequel, Volume 2, was better in some ways, yet worse in others, kind of a mixed bag overall. And now we have Volume 3, which was just released, using the same formula as the first two, but significantly amplified. What this means is that the good parts got even better, but also that the bad parts got much, much worse. I've heard others talking about this movie, giving it somewhat mixed reviews, saying that it's not amazing, but it's not terrible either. However, I think that most of this opinion comes from the fact that Marvel has been releasing such terrible content recently that anything even remotely approaching quality becomes refreshing, and therefore people are looking at this movie through a sort of jaded lens, where they're giving it more credit than it has actually earned, simply because in comparison to everything else, it looks better. But here's the truth. After watching this movie, I can tell you with certainty that it contains about 20 minutes of what can best be described as some of the best content ever put into the MCU. But unfortunately, that good content is sandwiched in between another 130 minutes of boring, unfunny, tedious, low-quality garbage.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
This once again prompts me to give a brief explanation of my review system. I don't use stars or a number system from 1 to 10, because as far as I'm concerned, whether a movie is a 7 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10, it doesn't really matter. They're both worth watching, even if one happens to be a little bit better than the other. So that's the system that I went with. Either something is worth watching, or it's not. Therefore, it's either good or it's bad, to keep it as simple as possible. Throughout this video, I'm going to explain all of the things that I liked about this movie, which were incredible, by the way, but I'm also going to give details about all the things that were terrible, which unfortunately massively outnumbers the good stuff. Ultimately, it boils down to the question, is this movie worth watching? Is it worth seeing 20 minutes of great content if you have to sit through 130 minutes of terrible content? And the answer to that is no, it's not.
It is a tale told by an idiot.
I think the best approach you could have towards this movie is to wait 3 or 4 months until people start posting the different parts of the movie on YouTube, and then watch a few of the really good scenes there, ignore the rest, and call it a day. There is no reason to sit down and watch this entire movie. There is quite a lot to go over in this movie. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get into all of that in this video. Instead, I'll make a complete, in-depth, scene-by-scene breakdown when the movie is available on streaming, and I can more properly show you all the different scenes that are going on. So let's start with the good stuff. Excellent! As mentioned, there's about 20 minutes of amazing content in this movie, and most of it comes from just 3 or 4 scenes. You might have noticed from the trailers that this movie focuses a lot on the backstory of Rocket. In the previous movies, it was shown that he was a lab experiment of some kind, and this was blatantly obvious. The audience didn't need to be specifically told this, making it largely unnecessary to go into great detail about what happened to him in the past, because we could pretty much already figure it out. However, having said that, the scenes with Rocket interacting with some of his other animal friends in a similar situation when they're in the lab were quite good. In particular, another character named Lila the otter was a standout performance. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this CGI character was more charismatic, more memorable, better acted, and had a more significant impact than 95% of the actual human actors that we've seen in recent years from the MCU. As an example, the MCU was trying to build up the Scarlet Witch throughout the entire WandaVision series as a sympathetic villain, and this continued into Doctor Strange 2, the Multiverse of Madness movie. The entire sequence of events from the series into the movie was meant to build up the ending of Doctor Strange 2 to make you feel bad for the Scarlet Witch and the predicament that she was placed in. However, it completely and utterly failed.
We don't care.
Let me tell you something.
We don't care.
The overwhelming majority of the audience had no emotional reaction to Scarlet Witch sacrificing herself at the end of that movie because nobody cared about her character. The emotional buildup had failed. Well, in this movie, it managed to deliver an emotional gut punch 1,000 times more significant with a stupid CGI otter who only had about 10 minutes worth of screen time, and I'm not kidding about that either.
You can actually pinpoint the second when his heart rips in half.
In fact, there were a few other emotional scenes that were also extremely well done. Later on in the movie, Peter Quill is trying to save the life of Rocket, and Chris Pratt delivers an absolutely outstanding performance while he's doing that. A lot of times when people are trying to act in an emotional scene, you can tell that they're faking it, and you usually end up with something sort of like this.
Don't do it! No!
But that does not happen here. What Chris Pratt does in this scene is completely and totally believable. The pain and grief that he is able to express and to portray on screen is some of the best emotional acting I've ever seen. Credit where it's due, because even if this movie overall was terrible, Chris Pratt still brought 110% and delivered an amazing performance. There was another significant emotional moment with a character named Cosmo the dog. This is a character that was briefly introduced in the previous movie and played a few small but important roles in this one. There was a bit of a running joke with the character about how she was a bad dog, but thankfully it got resolved before it started to overstay its welcome. Overall, I enjoyed seeing this character, and I have a feeling she's going to be used more in the MCU in the future, but my only concern is that Disney is going to end up doing what they always do, whether it's with Groot or Baby Yoda or whoever. They're going to overly monetize the character into oblivion until people start to get sick of her, which I hope doesn't happen because it is kind of a cool character. Another thing that was particularly awesome was a fight scene that happens near the end of the movie. It involves all the members of the Guardians of the Galaxy, including Gamora, who has temporarily rejoined, and essentially it's a long, one-take fight scene in a hallway that lasts for several minutes. It looks amazing, and even though I highly doubt it was actually filmed in a single take, it looks like it was, which gives it a far more realistic and visceral feeling.
I like it a lot.
It was nice to see because good fight scenes are something that have been desperately lacking for the last couple years in Marvel content. Usually what happens is the choreography is awful and the actors are simply incapable of performing most of the moves and the stunt work that they need to do to make it look good, so you end up with a fight scene that has a million different jump cuts trying to hide all of those problems, which in and of itself creates another problem of making the whole thing look fake and unrealistic. This was particularly egregious in the Black Widow movie, where everything just looked terrible. But this hallway fight scene is exactly what you would want it to be. It's something that you could probably just rewatch on YouTube every now and again just because it's that good. And it's probably one of the best fight scenes that's ever been done in the MCU. Like I said, there are some really, really good things in this movie, but unfortunately, there isn't enough of it, and what's left is just garbage.
Give me something for the pain, and let me die.
So before I go into the bad stuff, here's a brief synopsis of the story. The group minus Gamora is on Nowhere. That's the giant Eternals head that was used by the Collector. Suddenly, they get attacked by Adam Warlock. Rocket is seriously injured. The group can't save him through normal means, however, because the cybernetic implants have a sort of kill switch in them that will destroy the technology and Rocket if anybody tries to mess with it. The Guardians go to a space station to steal information about how Rocket was created. They get some of it, but are missing a crucial piece. Then they head to another planet called Counter-Earth, which is basically Earth, but it's run by highly evolved animal-human hybrid-looking things. They get the information they need to save Rocket, and then the villain of the story, the High Evolutionary, destroys Counter-Earth and everyone on it. The Guardians chase him into space. He's defeated, and the Guardians return to Nowhere, but then most of the group decides to leave for one reason or another. Rocket becomes the leader of the new Guardians of the Galaxy and creates a new group, with only Groot staying on with him. Alright, let's talk about the bigger problems in this movie, and there are quite a few of them. The first thing is that this movie is just way too long, and it suffers from the same problem that most of the recent MCU content also suffers from. It's bloated with unnecessary filler. The scene on the space station and on Counter-Earth take many times longer than they needed to. At one point, the Guardians are literally sitting down in some strange family's house and complaining about Drax trying to sleep on the couch. This takes up about 3 to 4 minutes of screen time, and it just falls flat. It doesn't work. It is extremely boring. And that's what we get for most of the so-called comedy, and I should put that in some really big fucking quotation marks. It's agonizing, and it drags on for far too long. I realize that humor is subjective, but let me paint a picture for you. Imagine some guy just told a joke, but no one else in the room is laughing, and then there's awkward silence, and people are just generally trying to avoid eye contact with him, and then a few moments go by, and the guy says, "It's because of the thing. You get it? You get it?" And then there's more awkward silence, and now people are just trying to make themselves look like they're busy so they don't get bothered by this guy anymore. And then he continues, and he says, "Get it? Get it? It's because of the thing. You get it?" And that's how the humor works in this movie. It's a bad joke that just gets dragged on and on and on, and it doesn't know when to end.
Please, no more!
This soul-crushing, unfunny scenario happens over and over throughout the entire movie. It's just like the Taserface quote-unquote joke that we had in Volume 2, but instead, this happens many, many times throughout this movie, and it's just not funny, and it's just, oh, it's agonizing. It's painful to watch this. But don't worry, it gets worse. Every movie will have music of some kind. Sometimes it's original, sometimes they use existing popular songs. Guardians of the Galaxy takes this a step further and integrates the music into the movie in a more natural way. Usually this is done when the characters themselves are listening to the songs that we're hearing during the movie. This is such a big part of the Guardians series that the movies are even given the subtitles of Volume 1, 2, and 3.
Oh, that's why they call it that.
Remember how I said that this movie amplifies everything and makes the good better and the bad worse? Well, the same thing applies to the music, particularly when it comes to the slow-motion music scenes. Slowing down time during a scene and putting some good music behind it can amplify the emotions of that scene, make it more powerful. And the movie does this sort of thing particularly well at least once. However, it also does this particular thing really badly about 5 or 6 more times.
Fell into a vat of redundancy? God damn!
This goes hand in hand with the stretching out bloated movie thing that I mentioned earlier. There are a whole bunch of scenes that have a time slow for no valid reason, and it probably adds 10 to 15 minutes of runtime. Almost every single time this happens, the movie also grinds to a screeching, jarring halt in regard to the pacing. But that leads me to the next two problems, namely, the pacing and the tone of this movie are all over the fucking place. The pacing gets ruined by long stretches of boring nonsense combined with the jarring stops of slow motion that I just mentioned. The tone is ruined by classic Disney Marvel mandatory humor, among other things. 1 second, the movie is giving us emotionally impactful scenes that I would say are on par with watching Tony Stark die, only to suddenly shift off to some stupid forced comedy section that isn't even funny.
What the fuck is this?
Also, for some very weird reason, there is a lot of yelling in this movie, and I mean a lot of yelling. Many, many times throughout this movie, the characters will just start yelling at the top of their lungs at each other. Usually it's because of an argument, but sometimes the movie is trying and failing to make a joke. In either case, it's irritating to listen to because the volume is so much higher than the rest of the stuff that's going on in the movie. Even the action scenes aren't as loud as some of these characters who are just yelling at each other for some stupid random reason.
Shut the fuck up!
This whole movie feels like a roller coaster ride, but it's not one of the good ones where you have a few minutes of excitement. No, instead, this is when the guy in the front row gets sick and he starts throwing up after the first turn, and you're about 10 seats behind him, and you spend the entire duration of the roller coaster ride trying to avoid getting hit by vomit. That's what it feels like to watch this movie.
This is terrible.
And speaking of things that are disgusting, the villain in this movie is a character known as the High Evolutionary. However, all of the nuance the character had from the comics has been stripped away, and he's been turned into nothing more than a mustache-twirling villain for this movie. More disgusting than that, the character has also been, say it with me, racistly blackwashed, because fucking of course.
Well, I definitely am not white.
After this was revealed in the early trailers, James Gunn attempted to explain that this change was not done for any political or ideologically motivated reasons, and instead, he only wanted to get the best actor for the job.
Lie to yourself if you must, but not to me.
Which we all know is a complete fucking lie. I'm sure there are some morons out there who'll actually believe him when he says that, but anyone with more than 2 brain cells to rub together can see this for exactly what it is. Either James Gunn or the studio, probably both, felt that they needed to add a little bit more diversity into this movie. Gamora is played by a black woman, but since she's completely covered in green paint during the movie, I guess that doesn't count. It's not good enough. So they had to racistly blackwash the villain in order to fulfill their fucking stupid quotas.
How pathetic.
Speaking of things that are absurd, let's talk about Adam Warlock. Why was he even in this movie? Yes, I know we saw his cocoon at the end of Volume 2, so it kind of makes sense that the character would have been included in Volume 3, but there's a little bit of a problem with that, because after Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, there were 15 movies that we got before Volume 3, not including a whole bunch of MCU content on the Disney Plus shows as well. But even more importantly than that was the fact that the Infinity War and Endgame had already occurred during that time frame. Adam Warlock plays a significant role in the Infinity Saga in the comics, but Thanos has already come and gone. The Infinity Stones are already destroyed in the main MCU timeline. The people that are in charge at Marvel made it abundantly clear that they don't even want to use the Infinity Stones anymore, which is why they were kind of turned into a joke in the Loki series. So introducing Adam Warlock to the MCU now doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but since he had been teased at the end of Volume 2, the character had to be included or else people would just constantly be asking about it. Suffice it to say, the colossal gap between Volume 2 and 3 made whatever plans James Gunn might have had been thrown out the window, and as a result, we got something that was added more as a necessity than as a creative choice. The much too late introduction of this character is shown even with his design. In the comics, Adam Warlock is the protector of the Soul Stone, and that is the object that he has attached to his forehead. But since the Soul Stone is gone in the MCU, they decided to just take a useless doodad and glue it to his face.
Congratulations, you're a failure.
The rest of the costume isn't much better either. It looks like something you would find on the CW. But don't worry, it gets worse. The actor, and I'm not saying this as a personal attack, but the actor that they chose for Adam Warlock simply does not fit appropriately for several reasons. The first is that this actor, while he is decent, he does not have the commanding screen presence that would be required to play the character of Adam Warlock. Adam Warlock is the kind of character who absolutely commands the attention of every single person in the room every time he goes in there. He's bold, he's charismatic, he's brilliant, and I hate to say it, but this actor just doesn't have the ability to do that. The second problem with him is the way he looks. In fairness, this actor does put a good amount of effort into maintaining physical fitness, but unfortunately, it's not enough for this character. Adam Warlock is supposed to be the absolute perfection of the human physique, and that is something that this actor is not able to pull off. Even though he works out clearly and he's got a lot of muscles, he doesn't look like a bodybuilder. Instead, he looks more like a powerlifter. So while he might have some muscle on him, he still also has kind of a chubby-looking appearance. And this might work for other characters, but it absolutely does not work for Adam Warlock, who is supposed to be the perfection of the human physique.
You're unworthy!
But don't worry, it gets worse. Oh man, it's about to get so much worse. You see, the biggest problem with the Adam Warlock character in this movie is the fact that he's retarded.
Was a bit controversial, to say the least.
Believe it or not, I'm not using that as an insult either. I mean that the character of Adam Warlock is quite literally retarded in the proper medical use of the word, as in, he is mentally deficient.
Stop acting like a fucking retard.
This is explained to us earlier in the movie because we're told that the High Evolutionary had removed Adam Warlock from his cocoon before he was quote-unquote ready.
That's the most retarded shit I ever heard.
This meant that while Adam Warlock's powers and abilities were in place, his mental faculties had not fully developed, which causes the character to become quite literally retarded.
I'm retarded?
This is even played off as an unfunny running joke numerous times throughout the movie. It's such a shame that this incredible character of Adam Warlock was turned into such a pathetic moron. It's just a waste of his character.
Well, that's retarded.
Another thing that's been a big problem in the last few years for the MCU is terrible CGI. However, this movie, for the most part, has pretty good CGI throughout the entire thing. There are a few occasions where the quality dips noticeably. However, the much bigger problem in this movie is the animal-human hybrid type characters that are found all over the Counter-Earth. This is a combination of what I assume is practical cosmetic effects, as well as some CGI that's been layered on top of it, and it just looks really, really bad.
Yeah, and you're ugly.
It kind of reminds me of the costumes from the original Planet of the Apes movie, and I don't know if this was done on purpose as an homage or a joke, or if this just ended up being a massive screw-up on why it looked so bad. In any case, it's one of those moments that kind of takes you out of the movie, and it completely destroys your suspension of disbelief because of how fake it looks. But now we have to talk about how the villain of the movie is defeated. Towards the end of the movie, the entire group of Guardians are able to fight and defeat the High Evolutionary, and Rocket is given the opportunity to finish him off, but he refuses, and he says the reason why is because he's a Guardian of the Galaxy, implying that they're the good guys and that the good guys don't do that sort of thing, which, as I've pointed out many times in the past, this is a bunch of stupid bullshit nonsense.
Oh, not this again.
One of the worst things that a so-called hero could ever do is to let the insanely violent villain continue to live. This is one of the biggest criticisms that I and many people have of Batman, because there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of innocent people who have died because Batman refuses to properly deal with villains like the Joker.
I started blasting. Bah! Bah!
But what's even dumber about this is that after Rocket refuses to finish off the High Evolutionary, the Guardians just kind of leave him there. They don't apprehend him, they don't try to detain him and bring him somewhere to be put on trial or anything. They just leave him there in the ship. And yes, the ship does get blown up shortly after, but the High Evolutionary isn't really all that injured at this point. He could easily have made it to an escape pod or some shuttle or something and managed to escape. And I want to point out, in case anybody has forgotten, that just previous to this fight, he had destroyed an entire planet of Counter-Earth, which was home to billions of people. Sure, they were weird animal-human hybrid-looking things, but they were still technically sort of people, and he killed billions of them. And now the Guardians are just gonna kind of, like, leave him there, like, oh, well, we beat him, and that's good enough, and, you know, we don't actually need to do anything more to punish this guy. Like, it's unconscionable that they would not actually try to either finish him off or bring him somewhere to be put on trial for all of the actions and the crimes that he's committed. This is just absurd.
You see? They are insane!
But don't worry, it gets worse. After the villain is defeated, and maybe he escapes, maybe he doesn't, who knows, who cares, regardless, Star-Lord tells the rest of the group that he's going to leave the Guardians of the Galaxy in order to go back to Earth in order to visit with his grandfather, who he hasn't seen since he was first taken off by the Ravagers. Some of this does make sense. Star-Lord wanting to go and visit the last remaining member of his family, sure. What doesn't make sense is for him to just quit the Guardians of the Galaxy entirely. Does he not realize that he could spend time with his grandfather and then return to the Guardians later on? Why would he want to quit them entirely? Mantis also says that she's going to quit the Guardians of the Galaxy, and her reason is even dumber. She says that first she was controlled by Ego, and she could only do what he wanted, and then later she was controlled by the Guardians of the Galaxy and could only do what they wanted, and now she wants to leave them so that she can decide what she wants to do with her life.
Who the hell is this bitch?
What the fuck is this stupid bitch talking about? She was never controlled by the Guardians. She might have initially left with them when Ego was defeated, but then she chose to join the Guardians of the Galaxy of her own free will. They were never controlling her. She could have left any time she wanted to. Quite the opposite, as we've seen earlier in this movie, Mantis has been the one controlling the different members of the Guardians of the Galaxy. During this movie, we were shown that she has the ability to control people's minds, and she doesn't just use this in combat or against enemies either. We're shown that she does this several times to other members of the Guardians of the Galaxy, most notably Drax. During the course of this movie, she made him fall in love with a sock or something because she thought it would be funny, and she also wiped his memory so that he wouldn't feel bad about something.
I wonder if you're the worst person I've ever met.
Since she didn't have permission to do this, it brings up some pretty serious ethical and moral questions about what exactly she's been doing to the other members of the group. But that's something I'll have to talk about a little bit more in the full in-depth breakdown video. But the point still remains that she was never under the control of the Guardians of the Galaxy at any point, and her desire to leave them in order to choose her own path is fucking idiotic, because the path she chose was to join the Guardians of the Galaxy after Ego had been defeated. But don't worry, it gets worse. Yes, believe it or not, somehow it gets worse. During the Guardians of the Galaxy Christmas special, which, by the way, is considered canon within the MCU, Mantis reveals that Ego was her father, making Star-Lord her half-brother. So I have to ask, why didn't Star-Lord invite her to come and visit with his grandfather? Why didn't she ask to go and see him too? Earlier in this movie, Mantis made a big deal about Star-Lord going to visit his grandfather again, and it was brought up several times, and this was important because it was the only remaining family that Star-Lord has. There are only 2 people in the entire galaxy that Mantis is blood related to, and that would be Peter Quill and his grandfather, because Mantis is blood related to her father, Ego, who is blood related to his son, Star-Lord, who is blood related to his mother, who is blood related to her grandfather. Basically, it's the family tree. While Mantis is not a direct descendant of Peter's grandfather, she's still in the family tree, they're still relatives, they're still blood related, and they're the only 2 people in the entire galaxy that Mantis could call relatives, and yet she has no desire to go and meet the only other person besides Star-Lord in the entire galaxy that's her relative?
But why would any woman want to do that?
Regardless, Drax also decides to quit the Guardians in order to help some of the rescued children that were taken off of the High Evolutionary ship, and he acts as an adopted father to all of them. Nebula also quits the Guardians, claiming that she's now going to run the city that is forming inside of nowhere. It should be pointed out that she isn't chosen for this role by anyone. She's not delegated or elected to this position. She just simply claims ownership of everything in Nowhere and tells the other people in the Guardians that she's going to run it, and apparently everyone just kind of goes along with this.
Are we the baddies?
Rocket becomes the new leader of the Guardians, and Groot is the only one that goes along with him, and they continue doing what the Guardians have been doing for the last couple years. And this finally brings us to Gamora. This is, of course, a different version from what we saw in the previous movies. This is Gamora taken from a different timeline before she had met the Guardians. We were told that she's been spending time with the Ravagers, and she wants nothing to do with the Guardians of the Galaxy. This seems kind of strange because while she might feel uncomfortable around Star-Lord, who's obviously still in love with her, Nebula is the only person that Gamora would consider to be family, and yet she's constantly avoiding her. I know that some people might have wanted Gamora and Star-Lord to get back together, but I don't think it was entirely necessary, and that having them continue separately is fine, as long as it had been handled properly. Unfortunately, spoiler, it wasn't handled properly, and it was fucking stupid. Throughout the entire movie, we're shown that this version of Gamora doesn't care about anyone or anything at all, including the Ravagers. Yes, she's staying with them, but it's made clear that she really doesn't give a shit about them. At one point, a fellow Ravager and his pet alien dog thing are captured by the bad guys. Gamora is able to contact this Ravager through a communication device and asks him for help so that she can leave the Guardians. However, this Ravager ends up getting killed, and Adam Warlock takes the alien dog thing and starts having it as a pet. Shortly after, Gamora sees this pet alien dog thing, but she doesn't even recognize it, even though It was a pet of one of her fellow Ravagers that she lived on the ship with, and yet Gamora just pretends like she doesn't know what it is and she doesn't recognize it at all, like she's never even seen it. Like, how would you not know what this thing is? You lived on the ship with the dude that owned this alien pet dog thing. And this is important because it shows that Gamora really doesn't know anything about her fellow Ravagers, and she certainly doesn't care about them. And I point this out because at the end of the movie, when she decides not to go with the Guardians and instead she goes back to the Ravagers, she starts smiling and laughing and hugging with them as if they were best friends this entire time. And all of this just looks really weird, and it is wildly, wildly out of character for this version of Gamora to actually be doing that sort of stuff. This is not how Gamora behaves. The old version, maybe kind of she would have possibly acted like this at some point, but definitely not this new version. The new version has not shown any kind of emotion like this at all. This is the sort of stuff that is completely and totally inconsistent with absolutely everything that we've seen about this version of Gamora. So okay, Star-Lord and Gamora don't get back together, that's fine. But why would Gamora go back to the Ravagers that she doesn't give a shit about at all, instead of spending some time with Nebula, who she has now been reunited with? It doesn't make any fucking sense. There are many, many other things that are also wrong with this movie, but all of that's gonna have to wait until my full breakdown video. As I said, this movie has about 20 minutes of really awesome, great content, and about 130 minutes of trash. And even though this is one of the best movies since the finale of Endgame, that doesn't really mean a whole lot, because even if something is on top of the garbage pile, it's still probably covered in shit.
Taking shots at the enemy, I'm gonna make it to the top, leave a legacy. If I got something to say, you better let me speak. Turn it up a new degree, bitch, you ain't seen anything. I pop off with the new rock, electronic, blow the sonic roof up. I'm too honest when I take a few shots, they're too toxic, need to